Oh, wow, that made it handy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I invited them, and they came up and saw my work, and they seemed to like it. I mean, I did not have the technique of them. I mean, I had my own technique, and it was pretty precise, but it was not exactly old master quality. But anyway. Anyway, so they looked at my stuff and they said, "Would you like to come and spend a week with us in the south of France?" I thought, wow, I mean, because they were living near Nice, up in the hills behind Nice. So I went, and it was a week that literally changed my life, because perched on the flanks of a hill overlooking Nice, we were talking all the time, as much as we could. It's true that his English wasn't very good. Ellen's English was very good, but anyway, it was a wonderful week, and I went sort of walking with him in the hills, and at one point he stopped and said to me, "Gordon," he said, "you and I, we are brothers." I mean, that really got me. Anyway, the point is that after having seen his work, it didn't happen immediately, but I realized that I wanted to be able to paint like the two of them, but I was missing maybe 12 years of art school. And so I kind of decided to try and paint with words. In other words, create the same kind of atmosphere, but in words. And it was not so long after that I moved to France, and I started writing this mega book. And this mega book, which I wrote, it was in the 1970s, was basically a retake of Genesis. I was recreating a civilization which lived in pre-glacial Antarctica. And this book, it ran to, I don't know, probably, at the time, it was typewriters, So when you made a mistake, if you made it with spelling mistakes, you had to retype the whole frigging page, We don't know how, well, we do know how well off we are now.
Well, you kept your local office supply store busy, selling paper at least to you, yeah.
Yeah, and I had to do it like with 4 carbon copies. This is prehistoric.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, I at the time I was a tour guide in Paris, and so I didn't have too much time. But I somehow, and I don't remember doing it. I really don't. I remember when I had the first idea for this story, and I remember vaguely doing it, but I mean, it must have taken me, a year and a half, 2 years. But I remember very little of that process. Anyway, it happened. And ultimately, I sent it off to a couple of publishers, one of which sort of returned it to me saying, yes, well, this is too ambitious for a first book. What a load of crap, eh? Anyway, so too ambitious for a first book. So it sat in my garage, and we moved house 2 or 3 times. It was there were a couple of carbon copies, and it was called Xandernatis. And Xandernatis was the name of this pre-glacial civilization. And there were. It was a kind of, it could make one think a tiny bit of The Hobbit, but it's one of the things that I did read the Hobbit at the time before it became so popular, thanks to the films, and Lord of the Rings, and Joffre and Ellen were great fans of Tolkien. Anyway, and it was telling the story of this pre-glacial civilization, but there was a twist, and that was that it was based. There was a big preface explaining how this story was found on documents discovered under the Antarctic ice in 1962.
Oh,
So
wow.
the entire book is based on these manuscripts. And the first chapter was a factual description of the expedition that discovered these urns, known as the Harkon urns, because they were found on the Harkon Plateau, which is in the central part of near the Transantarctic range, and then the rest. There was this fantastic story of somebody who wakes up and doesn't know who he is, and by discovering himself discovers this ancient civilization which had actually spawned the city, this golden city of Antarctica. And the story was interspersed with extracts from the Harkon urns, which were sort of very metaphysical and obscure and very literary. They weren't too long, but they gave a different twist to the actual story. Anyway, so this book sort of sat in my various garages and cellars, and then about 5-6 years ago, when I was winding down a bit from my hectic advertising life, because in the meantime I'd moved to the south of France and had been working remotely with a huge number of really prestigious clients and 4 or 5 of the top agencies in Paris for translations and adaptations and brainstorming and creative sessions and all this. Anyway, so I decided to get this book out, and I thought, well, here it is, all these massive pages, and I thought, okay, it would be good to rework it, but how can I get all these into the computer? Well, of course, I was able to do that thanks to dictation software, and it went relatively quickly. But anyway, and then 2 things came together, and I remembered Joffre, and I thought of his meta-realism, more real than real. And so what surprised me was when I read the actual story, I thought, well, it's really not so bad. And it was then I thought, I remembered the introduction. I reread the introduction of the discovery of the Harkon urns and the manuscripts. And I started adding things, adding documents to the shall we say, fantastic story. And these documents were things like mock-ups of newspaper articles. Like one of them, I sort of was able to reproduce a page from the Sydney Morning Herald, and there was an article with evidence of ancient civilization found in Antarctica. And it looked like a real article. And I pushed this out on the net, and people started saying, "Hey, we've never heard about this. My goodness, why haven't we heard about this?" And you know, it was the reaction was quite interesting. So I started adding these various parallel stories in present day life, tacking them onto the story of Xandenatis. And so before long, there were 4 or 5 or 6 parallel narratives sort of going on inside this story. And so it developed. First of all, there was a first volume called God, I don't even remember that in the first book. Anyway, and so this was the start, and then I did the second, and then I did the third, and ultimately I put them all together. It was called Predestination. The first one was called Predestination, the second was called Destination, and the third was called Apotheosis. And anyway, this, once put together as a single book, is a whacking great 772-pager.
Well, that's not going to be a weekend read.
It's not a weekend read.
No.
Anyway, now Now, what is quite interesting is that I've done quite a few radio shows on Xandernatis when it was the trilogy, or as I call it, the trinity of books, is called Genesis Antarctica. And if anybody wants to, you can check it out. You just put Genesis Antarctica into Google, and you'll find our mega website.
Oh, but better than that, Gordon, is the links you sent me to, to YouTube. I mean, I was really impressed with your productions of what you sent over, explaining what...
yeah.
Oh, it just knocked my socks off.
You saw the audiobook, because the audiobook was the 6-minuter. I discovered, there's another thing I discovered, that I loved, I can do because I did that one. And, I'm rather proud of it. So Genesis Antarctica. And the thing is that the other radio interviews I did, I wasn't actually telling them that it was all fictitious, or made up. And it got me into a bit of trouble, because I wouldn't actually say whether it was real or wasn't, whether it was real or not. And the slogan actually that sort of covered the approach was that Genesis Antarctica is as real as you need it to be.
Oh, yeah. It took me a second to figure that one out myself, Gordon, but I looked at that and I figured it out after maybe 30 seconds, but yeah. Hey, now, one thing I do want to interrupt you on. Okay, when you first went to have it published, they basically told you it wasn't, probably in a nice way, it wasn't good enough. Well, that wasn't the issue. You know what it is? Times have changed. Yeah. Paranormal thing right now in the last 5, 6, 7 years has really blossomed. So, I mean, people are hungry for this type of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. You're quite right. You are quite right. And because of the fact there were these articles in there, like the thing I did, as I say, for the Sydney Morning Herald, and all kinds of things happen in the book. Not only the newspaper clippings, but there's also the birth of a sect, and there is a manifesto, the Neo-Xandernatis order, and there's stories of this. Well, it's kind of like a sect. It's people who have taken the teachings that are in the book and turned it into the basis of a philosophy. And so that's just one of the sort of things that appears in between the ongoing stories of this protagonist called Gorin, who can't remember who he is, and who is sent out on a mission from the golden city of Xandernatis to discover their true roots. Now, Xandernatis, the golden city, was in fact created by is in fact full of hybrids of the progeny of angels and the Feblings, the native race who lived on Antarctica all those tens of thousands of years ago. And there is one unique characteristic about them, and that is that all the people who live in Xandernatis can remember all of their previous lives. So, just imagine that.
Yeah, I mean, they can remember. Okay, so that means they didn't even have to go to a hypnotist to go past regression. I mean,
you didn't have to have any. No past life regression. It was all there. And the thing is that they recognized each other. So, hello, look, you were my wife three lives ago. And she said, yeah. And do you remember when you were my son? And et cetera, et cetera. So they had this overspill of memories, but this was innocence. This was before the fall of man, and actually the book reveals that the fall of man was in fact the moment when the human race lost the ability to remember all their previous lives.
Well, I want to forget, when I die, I want to forget my life here, because my first marriage was really bad. So, the second marriage was okay, but I want to forget it. I want to forget about the first half of my life.
Yeah, I mean, and when you think that we've got all these other memories